If your great-grandmother was an orphan in 1890, what are the chances her parents were dead? About 10%. That is what Johns Hopkins research shows. 90% of children in American orphanages had a living parent, not orphans, not abandoned, taken from families that were still intact, and the system that took them called itself charity. I need you to understand how big this number is. In 1904, the Census Bureau counted 93,000 children in orphanages. Another 50,000 were placed in private homes. 25,000 more were locked in juvenile institutions. These were not children without families. These were children whose families were poor, immigrant, or simply inconvenient. The word orphan was a label, and it was a lie. I spent weeks going through the numbers, not estimates, not approximations, verified records from institutions that kept meticulous documentation of every child who crossed their threshold. What those records reveal is a system so pervasive and so deliberate that calling it charity requires ignoring almost everything we know about how it actually operated. The records prove it. Between 1847 and 1869, the Protestant Orphan Asylum of St. Louis kept meticulous admission logs. Every child documented, every family situation noted. Someone went through those records line by line. 27% were actual orphans, both parents dead. 4% had both parents alive. And 69%, more than 2 out of 3, had one parent still living. That institution wasn't saving orphans, it was processing families. And St. Louis wasn't unique. In New Orleans, researchers found that by 1915, only 15% of children registered with the Board of Prisons and Asylums were full orphans. Across the country, the pattern held. The vast majority of institutionalized children had families. Families that were told their children would be cared for, educated, returned. Many of those children never came home. Here is where the machinery becomes visible. The New York Juvenile Asylum was founded in 1851 by a group of businessmen. Its stated purpose was housing truant and disobedient children between the ages of 7 and 14. Children could be committed by a magistrate or surrendered by their parents during financial hardship. The expectation was temporary care. But the asylum had a different plan. Starting in 1854, it began shipping children west on trains. Not to temporary care, to indenture. Boys were bound until age 21. Girls until 18, indenture papers were signed, and in 1861 the Illinois State Legislature passed a special act making those papers legally binding. By the time the program ended around 1921, the asylum had indentured over 6,600 children, almost exclusively to farms in Illinois and Iowa. Many of those children had parents back in New York who never consented to permanent placement. Many were never told where their children went. Think about what that looks like from the parent's side. You bring your child to an institution during a crisis, a death in the family, a lost job, a winter you cannot survive. You are told the child will be safe, educated, fed. You expect to come back when the crisis passes. Instead, your child is on a train to a farm in Illinois. Their name is in a ledger, their indenture is legally binding, and no one contacts you to ask permission or inform you it happened. The institution that promised temporary care has permanently redistributed your child as agricultural labor. Now I can already hear the objection. These were desperate times. Cities were overcrowded. Parents couldn't feed their children. The orphanages provided food, shelter, and education. The trains gave children opportunities they never would have had in the slums. It was imperfect charity in an imperfect era, not a conspiracy. And I considered that explanation seriously. Until I looked at who the system targeted, because if this was about saving children from poverty, the selection would have been random. It wasn't, it was surgical, and it followed religious, ethnic, and racial lines with disturbing precision. Charles Loring Brace was a Congregationalist minister from Connecticut, Yale educated, theologically driven. In 1853, he founded the Children's Aid Society in New York City, which would become the single largest operator of orphan trains. Brace was explicit about his motivations. He viewed Catholic parents as unworthy, almost by definition. He believed removing children from Catholic immigrant households and placing them with Protestant farming families in the Midwest was a moral imperative. And that's exactly what he did. The majority of homeless children in Manhattan were Irish Catholic. Brace sent them to rural Protestant homes across the country. The Catholic Church accused him of using charity as a front for religious conversion. His own record proves them right. After Brace died in 1890, his sons finally banned the placement of Catholic children under 14 through the emigration program. By the 1890s, the Children's Aid Society restricted placements to Protestant white children exclusively. They didn't change the policy because it was working badly. They changed it because the pattern had become undeniable. The charity was a pipeline, and the pipeline sorted children by faith. By 1920, the Children's Aid Society and approximately 1,500 other agencies had placed roughly 150,000 children through similar programs. Less than half of those children were actual orphans. Approximately 1 in 4 had 2 living parents. These numbers come from the institution's own records. The system knew what it was doing. The Catholic Church responded by building its own institutions at a furious pace. By 1910, 322 Catholic orphanages served nearly 70,000 children annually. The New York Catholic Protectory operated what amounted to an industrial labor facility. 400 boys were making shoes in its factory by 1875. By 1900, the Protectory was training children in plumbing, masonry, bricklaying, and sign painting. Girls worked in sewing rooms. The church wasn't saving children from the streets. It was saving them from Protestants. And in the process, it built its own system of institutional control that looked remarkably similar to the one it opposed. Here is a detail that says the quiet part out loud. In 1905, the New York Juvenile Asylum moved to a new facility in Dobbs Ferry. The new campus had room for less than a third of the children from the Manhattan building. They had to choose who to transfer. The children they excluded from the move were African American, Jewish, and Catholic. Those children were discharged or transferred to other institutions in Manhattan. The selection criteria were not academic, not behavioral, not medical. They were racial and religious, written into the operational records of a publicly recognized child welfare institution. But the religious dimension was only one face of the operation. In Cleveland, the Jewish Orphan Asylum opened in 1868, originally established for children who lost parents in the Civil War. By the 1890s, it housed around 500 children annually, almost all of them Eastern European Jewish immigrants. The institution was run not by Orthodox Jews, but by acculturated German Jews who had arrived decades earlier. Their goal was explicit: Americanize the children, strip the Yiddish, replace Orthodox Judaism with Reform Judaism, make them workers, not scholars. The methods were thorough. Children's mail was censored. Parental visits were restricted to July and August only. Boys received manual training to become laborers. By 1906, intermarriage rates among alumni were 13% for women and 9% for men, far exceeding the Jewish community average. The institution described these numbers as evidence that its Americanization program was working. Think about what that means. The institution measured its success by how effectively it had severed children from their cultural identity. And most of these children were not orphans. They had parents who were alive but deemed culturally unfit. Maybe I am seeing patterns where none exist. Maybe each of these institutions operated independently, responding to different pressures in different communities. Maybe the Catholic pipeline and the Jewish Americanization program and the Protestant placing out system were just parallel responses to the same underlying crisis of poverty. That's what I told myself before I looked at what happened to black children after emancipation. In 1865, when slavery ended, former slaveholders across the South faced an immediate problem. Their labor force was legally free, so they found a legal workaround. Across Maryland and other border states, former owners petitioned orphans' courts to bind emancipated black children as apprentices. The courts declared black parents incapable of supporting their children. Then they bound those children, some as young as 3 years old, to the very people who had owned them. The working conditions were identical to slavery. The apprenticeships required children to pick tobacco or cotton. The parents had no say. One mother described being taken by force to the courthouse, where they would not let her say a word while they bound her child to a former slaveholder. Mary Frances Berry, former chairwoman of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, calls this practice what it was: slavery after slavery. The U.S. Supreme Court eventually struck down Maryland's apprenticeship law in the case In Re Turner. But by then, thousands of black families had already been torn apart, and the children scattered by this system disappeared into a record void that persists to this day. 4 populations, 4 institutions, 1 pattern. Protestant orphanages taking Catholic children and sending them to Protestant farms in the 1850s through 1890s. Jewish orphan asylums stripping Eastern European identity from the 1860s through the 1920s. Black children apprenticed back to their former owners from 1865 through the 1870s. And Native American children removed from their families and sent to boarding schools starting in the 1870s, continuing through the 1960s. The architect of the boarding school system, Captain Richard Henry Pratt, stated his philosophy plainly in 1892: "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." By 1900, 20,000 native children were in boarding schools. By 1925, that number exceeded 60,000. Congress passed a law in 1891 requiring native parents to send their children or lose food rations. Over 400 schools operated across 37 states for 150 years. Children who spoke their own language were beaten, their hair was cut, their names were replaced, their clothing was burned, they were punished for praying in their own tradition. Parents who tried to hide their children were threatened. Families who refused were told their food rations would be cut off. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania processed over 12,000 children during its operation. The before and after photographs they took of students are still in the archives. A child arrives in traditional clothing with long hair. 6 months later, the same child in a Western suit, hair cut, staring blankly at the camera. The school kept those photographs as proof of progress. Same method: take the child, erase the culture, reshape the identity, call it progress. This was not 4 separate programs, this was one operation with 4 faces. I keep returning to the St. Louis numbers. 69% had one parent, 4% had both. Those parents walked their children through those doors. They signed papers. They believed the institution would care for their child and eventually give them back. Many of those children were placed on trains within months, shipped to farms 1,000 miles away, given new names, sometimes new religions. Their parents waited. Some waited their entire lives. And if you are watching this because your family tree hits a wall around 1870 or 1880 or 1890, this might be why. The records go blank because someone designed them to go blank. The connections were severed on purpose. Not by accident, not by fire, by policy. You might be descended from someone who was processed through one of these institutions. Someone whose original name was changed. Someone whose religion was replaced. Someone whose parents spent years searching and never found them. The wall in your family tree might not be a gap in history. It might be the exact place where the system did what it was designed to do. On January 25, 1909, President Theodore Roosevelt convened 215 people at the White House for the first ever conference on the care of dependent children. Social workers, judges, labor leaders, civic reformers. The catalyst was a campaign launched by the novelist Theodore Dreiser through the Delineator magazine, demanding the government address what was happening inside these institutions. The conference reached a conclusion that should have ended the system overnight. Home life is the highest and finest product of civilization. Except in unusual circumstances, the home should not be broken up for reasons of poverty. Read that again. The government's own experts concluded that the entire orphanage system had been separating children from families based on poverty alone. For decades. The conference led to the creation of the Children's Bureau in 1912. It sparked the widow's pension movement. It began the slow dismantling of institutional childcare. But by 1909, over 100,000 children had already been placed. The families had already been scattered. The identities had already been erased. They acknowledged the machine was broken. They never acknowledged the damage it caused. No reparations were offered. No reunification efforts were funded. No national registry was created to help separated families find each other. The system was quietly wound down over the following decades. The children already scattered were left to figure out their own histories, or not. What if the orphan trains weren't flawed charity at all? What if they were a labor pipeline disguised as rescue? The American West needed workers, farms needed hands, growing communities needed population. And eastern cities had a surplus of immigrant children whose families were too poor, too foreign, or too Catholic to fight back. 150,000 children were placed between 1854 and 1929, not because they had no families, because their families had no power. And the genealogy dead ends that millions of Americans encounter today, those family trees that stopped cold at 1870 or 1880, may not be gaps in the record at all. They may be evidence of a system that separated children from their origins so completely that the connection was never meant to be traced back, and that is not speculation. That is what the records, when you can access them, actually show. Children admitted under one name, placed out under another, sent to states where no one knew their family, given indenture papers that replaced their identity with a contract. The architecture of erasure was built into the paperwork itself. The buildings are gone now. Most of the orphanages were demolished or converted decades ago. The records that survive are often sealed, closed to the public because of their personal and sensitive nature. The last known orphan train rider died in 2018. But the documentation exists if you know where to look. The Columbia University archives hold the New York Juvenile Asylum records from 1851 to 1954. The Cleveland Jewish Orphan Asylum records survive at Belfair in Shaker Heights. The Freedmen's Bureau apprenticeship documents are in the National Archives. The Carlisle Indian School records are at the National Archives as well. The evidence is there, scattered across institutions that have no incentive to connect the dots. But 90% of those children had living parents. Someone made a deliberate choice to take them anyway. And someone made a deliberate choice to call it charity. Who were the 90%? Why did they really lose their children? And what happened to the families who spent the rest of their lives not knowing where their sons and daughters ended up? The records are still sealed, the family trees still have walls, and no one in any official capacity has ever explained why. Why was the system that was supposed to protect children designed from the beginning to erase them from their own history?